Hello everyone and welcome to Conversations at Hub101.Earth. My name is Atouguia and I'm the founder and managing director of Hub101.Earth, a global open access platform for knowledge sharing on climate, nature and environmental topics. Today I am in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I'm delighted to be speaking to Monique Atouguia from NatureFinance. Welcome, Monique.
Thank you so much.
So Monique, I'm going to just read out your title. So you are a senior consultant and the former African global lead at NatureFinance, and based in Johannesburg. So can you tell us a bit about NatureFinance? You know, what is this organization? What do you try to do? And specifically, what is your role?
Yeah, so NatureFinance is an international, we like to say think, do tank. We're an international NGO. Our mission is to align the global economy to nature positive and equitable outcomes. And obviously that's a very big ambition, but we try to approach it from various angles. So we try to look at nature risk. Can we understand nature risks and dependencies with various actors? So we work with multilateral development banks, development finance institutions, we work with central banks, we work with governments, we work with the private sector, and kind of aligned to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We believe that if you can get the private sector, development finance to better understand their relationship and their dependencies on nature, you can better align financial flows towards more constructive investments. So there's a lot of work in that space. We also do a lot of work on sustainability in sovereign debt, so aligning KPIs to sustainable outcomes, looking at how that can lead to better credit enhancement, better credit ratings, by showing that investment in nature is an investment in economic resilience. So quite a bit of great, really technical work in that space. And then the work that I've been involved in sort of from the beginning is really looking at the nature market space. So where are we seeing nature positive markets emerge, whether that's new instruments like biodiversity credits or a completely new economic paradigm that moves us away from a fossil fuel-based economy to a bio-based economy like the bioeconomy.
And that's a fairly broad set of different things under, that ticks both the nature and the finance box, right? I guess hence the name.
Yeah.
So when you talk about nature risk, actually, can you explain a bit what you mean by that? What is nature risk?
Yeah. So I think it's becoming more and more apparent. For example, in agriculture, the decline of biodiversity, specifically in pollinator species, means directly the decline in crop yields, which is a food security issue. You can look at a number of businesses here in Southern Africa who are really feeling the economic and sort of cost impact of water stress. That's a nature risk and a nature dependency. So for businesses, that looks a specific way. For countries, that's a very real thing, whether it's impacts on healthcare, on other state services. It's not just about climate disasters, it's also about the decline in biodiversity and the dependency on nature. Our economy is 100% dependent on nature. There is no economy without nature. We rely on all kinds of ecosystem services for everything in our economy. And we know that even grey infrastructure is highly dependent on what we would call ecological or green infrastructure. So I think businesses, particularly with the Task Force on Nature-related Disclosures, are only just beginning to grapple with what does this mean, nature dependency and risk. But also once you start mapping it, there's also a set of opportunities. So when you start investing in those services that are essential for the running of your business or the livelihood of your citizens or your country, there are real returns as well. So in the water stress example, we've seen companies, development finance institutions and central banks realize, well, if we invest in our water catchment and our water health systems, that has real economic benefits. And so I mean, natural capital accounting is not a new thing, but seeing that sort of being applied and realized in a more economic sort of balance sheet approach is helping, I think, different actors understand that in a more, dollars and cents sort of,
Absolutely. It's kind of bringing nature and elements of nature, which we have always depended on, as you say, onto our balance sheets, onto our investment decisions, onto decisions that you and I make every day. Because I think previously much of nature and what we used are just kind of taken for granted. That it's there, we can use it. Much of it was the public good and it was for free, and unfortunately, so much of it has degraded over time. No, that's, I mean, absolutely so fascinating. But before we dive into the bio-related economy piece and also nature markets, which are very interesting, let's talk about you a little bit. So what is your in terms of your background, how did you get into this nature finance space from your studies and your career path so far?
Yes, I could not have seen myself here even 5 years ago. So my sort of academic background is interdisciplinary. I did a BA in economic history, politics and English, and then a postgrad honors in justice and transformation, and a master's in organizational and institutional studies.
Studied a lot.
And then I sort of, my early career was really in the public policy advocacy space, doing a lot of convening around key issues, first in South Africa and then across the continent. And then my previous role before this, I was working in a small consultancy firm called Concentric Alliance. And we were doing a lot of conflict resolution, consensus building and stakeholder engagement. And in South Africa, that's really with big industry, but it invariably is with mining. And I think my exposure to mining communities who have been mining communities on an intergenerational, really long timeline, I always joke that it radicalized me, but it made me realize that if we don't change the economic logic and incentives, there's just no, you can tinker and you can regulate, and there are really positive developments, not just in mining, but many other sectors. But if you don't change the underlying logic and incentives of our financial systems, we will just continue down this road where we are, in breach of the Earth's limits and boundaries. And so I think that's how I ended up in the space. But on a practical sense, somebody kind of put my name forward. NatureFinance at the time was hosting the task force on nature markets. And I was brought in to manage that task force. And at the time, nature markets was a very new thing. And there is still some resistance to the term nature markets. But as we've just said, all nature is already priced. It's just priced badly and with perverse incentives. So we know that a felled tree is worth more than a standing tree. And if we don't change that, the underlying economic logic of that, we will continue to incentivize the destruction of nature. So to say that we shouldn't commercialize nature is it's a bit misleading, because I think we already do.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. So my background is in economics, and I just started realizing that if you price something at zero or don't price it at all, it just means then it gets taken for granted.
Exactly.
And you end up using way too much of it at no cost. And very interesting to hear your background as your evolution through coming to, all the way through to nature markets. So on nature markets then, can you explain a bit what are nature markets? Because I think that may be something that's not entirely familiar to all of our audience. Although we do have, for those who users of our site, we have explainers on biodiversity credits and things like that. But Monique, tell us a bit more about nature markets.
Yes, so there again, I think are very different definitions in this space. When we were working in the task force, we took this sort of broad view, which I've just outlined, which is that any market which prices nature should be considered a nature market. So that can be your absolute oldest market, like your food markets, or it could be these new and exciting biodiversity or nature credits, where we are trying to develop new finance instruments which will allow us to invest in nature's preservation and conservation. So the Task Force on Nature Markets looked at all of these and really tried to make, I think we had, at the end of the task force, it was an 18-month duration. I think we had over 20 knowledge products, so papers kind of looking into some of these markets, thinking about all the ramifications. But essentially, with the climate crisis and increasing biodiversity loss, our founder, NatureFinance's founder, Simon Zadek, and the two co-leads of the task force, Simon Zadek and Marcelo Furtado, basically felt that, and you'll know from having an economics background, with scarcity comes increased demand. And so there was an increasing view that nature would be increasingly priced. And if we didn't think about what the parameters should be or how some of these newer markets should develop, that could be a real crisis in and of itself, rather than something helping us address the existing crisis. So that was a lot of the work of the task force. And we did, like I say, we spent quite a bit of time on biodiversity credit markets and working with a number of really fantastic actors in that space who have continued the work. But also, I think really important to look at foundational markets of our global economy and really thinking about how those need to change as well, and how the financial flows need to change in those foundational markets. And then how we develop new markets and a new sustainable circular economy. And that's kind of what also led us to the bioeconomy work. Because while we need mechanisms to invest in conservation and restoration efforts, we also need to think about, in a very urgent way, how we move away from fossil fuel-based industry. And that's not just oil and gas. There are a number of industries that are completely reliant and intertwined with fossil fuel industry. So that actually requires a whole economy approach. So that is kind of how we approached it. And we were guided by 16 high-level members and 16 knowledge partners coming with different levels of expertise. And that's how we ended up in the bioeconomy space.
It's so interesting. Is sort of all of these different components are trying to create an economic case for the protection and sustainable use of nature, right? So nature market is one mechanism, and bioeconomy is another idea. And you and I met at a bioeconomy panel last week at the Business of Conservation conference in Nairobi. And so moving right on to bioeconomy. So we also have a module on bioeconomy. Please do check it out. But so tell us a bit about what is it? What is a bioeconomy? What does it mean?
Yes. So there is no singular definition or widely accepted definition. And I think that's also because the bioeconomy is inherently local. So you'll see that there are a number of countries that have bioeconomy strategies or policies, but they approach it in very different ways. Even sort of policy versus implementation can also be quite different. So I have a definition that I like, which I'll read to you, which is really that the bioeconomy is broadly understood as turning renewable biological resources into higher value products, goods and services, but also industries and jobs. And the idea is to replace extractive low value exports with diversified innovation driven value chains. But really, how I like to speak about it is an economy with a biobase. So it utilizes biological resources and processes to produce goods, services, energy, but then also jobs, economic growth, sustainable development. So that's the way I like to think about it. And it's fascinating. So our event in Nairobi explored this a bit because it really helps us think beyond the just transition, so beyond energy, thinking about how all these different sectors and parts of the economy can shift to a more sustainable model.
Yeah.
So the bioeconomy helps us both reduce emissions, value our biomass and our biological resources, because by understanding how it can have a high value addition, there's actually an incentive to protect it. And it also is moving us from a fossil fuel and destructive economy to something that hopefully can be more circular, more efficient on waste management and resource use.
Oh, that's the, I know it's very much an economy, as you say. I love that definition. It's quite holistic.
Yeah.
That it involves biological processes, our natural world, but it also involves people, right? So people has to be at the heart of any solution, otherwise it will not last, and it's not impactful as you'd hope it to be. So in terms of what the real work that comes with a bioeconomy, which organizations do you work with on promoting the idea of bioeconomy, or just spreading the word and making it scale?
So I think this really speaks to NatureFinance's work and how we try to play a unique role, because historically the bioeconomy has been pretty niche. It's actually an old concept. It's not really a new concept, but it has tended to be very scientific and innovation driven, which has meant that it has sat in a very technical space often. And while there is policy around this, either it comes from a government perspective, it either comes from an agricultural department and mandate, and the need to diversify and innovate in that space, or it comes from a science and technology space, or even it can also come from an energy space in recent years. So NatureFinance's involvement in the bioeconomy really, as I said, came out of the task force on nature markets, realizing that there would be a need to really think more carefully about how we put these clear guardrails and protections and parameters in nature markets, was really thinking about the real economy and needing to work with real economy actors, and real economy actors really needing to grapple with how to transition away from one kind of economy to a different kind, because that really requires multi-stakeholder investment and participation. It requires reform at a policy level, but also at a regulatory, at a financial level. It requires awareness. It requires collaboration across different government departments and institutions. So we got involved during the Brazilian G20 presidency. They introduced the initiative on the bioeconomy for the first time. And it was the first time that in a multilateral setting, this conversation around a bio-based economy was really brought to the fore. And that work continued into the South African presidency. So we've been working very closely at a government level. And like I said, there often isn't a single ministry represented in these multilateral forums, because countries approach it in such different ways. But then there are obviously scientific institutions which are doing some fascinating work. So in South Africa, we've worked really well. I feel very privileged to know so much about their work and have seen so much of their work, but we work with the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, CSIR. They're kind of thinking about bringing the science to entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurship to the market. So they're really translating these innovations into something that can be economically viable, and to turn some of these entrepreneurs into into industry players who can really shape a different economy. And likewise, you would have heard from Esipe, which is part of BioInnovate Africa, and they are doing very similar innovations around insects and how we think about mycoproteins, pest management, agricultural inputs, a much more efficient use of resources, how we use agricultural waste in a much more sustainable way. So some of these more technical institutions. And then there are industry players. So for example, in South Africa, the sugar industry is actually going through a very difficult time. And they have an existential need to diversify away from their traditional sugar production approach to higher value products. And a lot of this sits in the bioeconomy space, and a lot of these products, where the demand is growing, it's growing because our global economy needs to shift to lower emissions and more bio-based alternatives. So an example of that is bioplastics. It's alternative fuels like furfural that can be used in construction, which is a very high intense emission industry. There's a number of industry players, whether it's energy or sugar or forestry or agriculture. There are these scientific institutions. There's the financial institutions, because we really want financial institutions, whether they are private or development, to understand their role in developing new industries that are bio-based, that are green, in helping existing industries diversify and shift towards greener practices. And in really understanding, particularly for the development finance institutions, understanding their role in opening up those markets, because early investment is some of the most difficult. It's the most difficult hurdle often.
It's so interesting that it takes such a diverse set of actors, and all of them has a role to play in pushing this concept and this idea forward. And it's so interesting to see that you are NatureFinance is sitting in the middle of it. And it's fascinating how the projects that some examples you mentioned, I was going to ask you for some examples that you've mentioned, range from locusts to the sugar industry and, beyond, and agriculture. So many interesting. Is there a particular example that you like?
I think it's, for many people working in this field, I think it can be really hard, and you can get really down sometimes following the science of where we are in sort of like biodiversity loss and climate events. And I often think I'm very privileged, because I sit in this really exciting innovation space where people are really solution driven, and many of these things are in response to crisis and challenges. And because they have they're a bio solution, they're working with nature often. It's an innovation coming out of nature, which is as humans, our oldest, most sacred way of thinking about things. And we didn't really discuss this in the definition, but a lot of this is really about recognizing traditional and indigenous knowledge. And you are seeing that in some of these institutions. So for example, the CSIR, in collaboration with the University of the Free State, have an indigenous knowledge lab where they are working with traditional healers, not just in South Africa, but across the continent, who can bring their knowledge to the lab. The lab will test it, verify it, do trials, and verify some of that knowledge. So that's quite an exciting thing, because it's bringing that knowledge to a larger audience, a larger market. It's allowing those healers to have their knowledge valorized and to have that benefit. So they also help with sort of the business side. Like if it's a community, can they help the community build a business or have the proceeds go into a trust? So really creating a pathway and a translation. Kind of linked to that, I love the rooibos example, which I know came up at BCC, where rooibos is a plant that grows only in the Western Cape of South Africa. It has medicinal properties, it has cosmetic applications, but it's most commonly drunk as a tea. And a few years ago, there was a constitutional court ruling recognizing the role that the san and the koi played in cultivating the plant so that we would have all these applications and uses that we now have, which mean, and the outcome of the ruling was that 1.5% of the proceeds of rooibos when it leaves the farm gate goes to these communities. And so they're getting real benefits from their traditional knowledge cultivated over many, many, many years. But to kind of come to some of the other examples, I think the insect examples are fascinating. We heard a few in Nairobi. I really loved the sort of, it kind of came out of the audience about, you know, with things being more out of balance, pest control is such an issue for farmers. And not only at Atouguia are they thinking about how we use insects in feed, in food, in a number of agricultural inputs and applications, but also thinking about how we can use insects as a non-synthetic, non-chemical way of pest control. So for pesticides, we're thinking, for that example, they were using the pheromones from the locust to move them away from the agricultural farming, which I think is fascinating. It's also, I think, critically important to use bio-based pesticides so that we're not killing off our other pollinators and destroying the health of the soil. There's black soldier fly. We got to see we did a visit at Atouguia when we were in Nairobi, and we got to see their warehouse of black soldier fly. Black soldier fly is fascinating because when they are worms, so there's a 9 to 14 day period when they are still worms, and they can eat tons and tons of organic waste. So it's completely a waste solution, whether you're on a farm or if you're in the city and you need to process organic waste. That's a reduction in methane and carbon emissions immediately. It's also a hygiene solution because it completely neutralizes the smell. It's a really useful way to solve waste challenges, essentially. And in a lot of agricultural practices, sometimes the waste is just burnt. So it's really useful there. And then the pupae, so that period between after they are worms, before they become flies, is super rich in protein. And so is a really useful animal feed input or for pet food. But largely, a lot of animal feed now is from soya, which we know has deforestation implications. It's very land use intensive. What we're talking about here is a warehouse. And you can get the pupae, I think something like 6 times a year versus harvesting soybeans once a year. So it's much more resource efficient. It can be very controlled. It has a very circular sort of supply. And then the flies themselves also have various applications. So the black soldier fly is fascinating. It's very accessible for sort of from a smallholder farmer to even you could use it in urban waste management, very applicable, quite a range. Then there are some very high-tech applications. There's a fascinating organization in South Africa called E08, and they are deriving proteins and enzymes from cellulose and biomass and using that in healthcare applications, in cosmetics. And yeah, there's very similar other organizations that work with lignin in the same way. Lignin can be derived from timber or sugar waste. And it has multiple applications from fuel to industrial and construction application to glues and all kinds of things. And yeah, this is essentially derived from a waste. Also it has healthcare and cosmetic applications. I believe it's also really good for skin, sunscreen, collagen, that kind of thing. So there's a lot to be said about the high-tech end of the bioeconomy. And a great example, I think, is furfural, which I mentioned earlier. Both can be used as a fuel, but also in, drilling and construction applications. The demand for this is growing because it's much less, obviously, emissions, much better manufacturing. The way that it's done is a lot easier to attain. And yeah, it's a bio-base. And I think this comes back to your question about Africa. For the continent, I think this is a leapfrogging opportunity. This is an opportunity to leapfrog into green industrialization, to enter global markets that now need to and have an imperative to shift to emissions reduction activity and bio-based alternatives. There's all kinds of opportunities in this space. I mean, I think another example that came up, we often talk about bioplastics, but that's not always about, plastic bottle. There are examples now of banana leaves or banana fiber and pineapple fiber being used in the dashboard of cars.
Yeah.
So as an alternative to like a fossil fuel-based plastic, we now have what would essentially be waste, something that might have been burnt or just put into compost, can become like a really manufacturing industrial application in like something like a vehicle. So there are so many fascinating examples, and I think for the continent it's a really exciting opportunity because not only is it the biomass that many of its uses we haven't already discovered, we don't really know like what its applications could be, whether in healthcare or cosmetics or any of these other things, but it's also about thinking about replacements all along various supply chains. And we were talking about TNFD earlier. As businesses begin to understand their risks and dependencies across their supply chains, this is an opportunity to look, to these nature-rich countries which can provide those solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are such fascinating examples, and it looks like you can collect this kind of bioeconomy-based knowledge from, as you said, indigenous people, local communities, very tech-based university research labs. The idea can come from anywhere, and it's about kind of incubating that idea and turn it into a viable business that can scale and very much. Nature itself is circular, right?
Yeah.
So many of the natural processes there is no waste. So if we mimic that, that would just be so helpful in reducing how much waste we're currently pumping out into our natural world. So let me ask you about. So those are very much the opportunities, and I have questions around how we can scale it, etc. So perhaps that's one of the challenges that may face bioeconomy as we seek to scale it. What do you think are some of the challenges in growing these ideas and making them applicable to a wider set of situations and circumstances? How do we scale it?
Yeah, so this has really been the focus of the deliberations in these multilateral fora, in the G20, for example. There are a couple of challenges. One is financing. So the exciting thing about the bioeconomy is that we already have businesses who are translating these innovations into real market solutions. Many of them struggle to access capital markets or to move beyond what is called the valley of death. So they might get that incubation support in the beginning, but scaling to become like really competitive is really a challenge. And that's not just an African thing. We hear that from European colleagues, American colleagues, people from all around the world, everybody who was involved in the G20. And some of that is structural, because we know that fossil fuel industry has benefited from subsidies for many, many years, and there's a lot of integration across those different markets. Some of these things have low-hanging fruit solutions. So, for example, one of our inputs for the G20 initiative on the bioeconomy last year was a paper on trade and really understanding how we leverage trade as a sort of a place where, I always like to phrase it this way, a place where policy meets the market. How do we think about regional trade and international trade as a way to grow the bioeconomy? As an example, often bioplastics are regulated in the same way as fossil fuel derived plastics. This feels like a double penalization, right? They're not really getting the benefit of subsidies, but then at the same time they are being policed in the same way that a fossil fuel plastic is. Then there are all kinds of systems that would need to adjust to create the incentives for these industries to grow, just in the same way we saw with renewable energy. Without those early incentives, you could not get to a place where now renewables are cheaper than your traditional fossil fuel-based energy production. So there's a sort of policy enablement question here, whether it's at a national level, a multilateral level, and that will require all kinds of intervention, not just by governments, but financial institutions also need to think about the incentives that they structure to make these industry, or to make, I like to think of it as moving from small and medium businesses to industry. That's kind of what we see. And your question around circular economy often does rely on scale. So it's only when we can take all the agricultural waste of farmers that we will see a real reduction in their emissions, right? It's only when a lot of people can shift their thinking in waste management that you really will see a real impact. And many of these processes also require high volumes of biomass for the manufacturing costs to make sense. So for a small business, that's a really big consideration. But on that topic, one of the legacies that came out of the South African G20 initiative on the bioeconomy was the African Bioeconomy Finance Hub. And its 4 pillars really come from the challenges as identified within the G20. So I already mentioned the one, which is policy enablement. Really thinking about that from various ways, whether it's through trade regulation, incentives. You can take a public procurement approach, for example. The US has that. It's called biopreferred, where you really create some mandatory requirements for government departments to source bio-based alternatives where they exist. And that can really build a market. It can really build a domestic market and really support these new industries. There's capacity building, and that capacity building, I've kind of spoken to it a lot, is at various ends, whether it's helping financial institutions, whether it's working with governments to understand the way the global regulation and global markets are shifting, or thinking about good policy setup. And then there's also working with the SMMEs, the small, micro, and medium enterprises. And then this was a big area and a big challenge, is data and metrics. Because the bioeconomy, as you've heard me describe it, is completely cross-cutting, like in traditional sectors as we see them, which means that various government departments need to have a shared language around this, a shared thinking on how they measure developments and outcomes. You can't grow something that you can't measure. Likewise, for financial institutions, that also needs to translate for them. Financial institutions quantify risk, and that's how they make investments, right? So there's a big data and metrics question here. And then the final thing in the Africa Bioeconomy Finance Hub is investment catalyzation. So I've mentioned a number of really exciting innovations and examples to you that we know that small businesses are working on. But those businesses will tell us that they really struggle to get investment, that they approach so many financial institutions, whether it's development or private, and they really struggle to get the investment that they need. And then when you go to the financial institutions, they will tell you that often these businesses are not investment ready, or there's something that they're lacking in their business plans or their governance. And so it kind of links back to the capacity building, but there's really, it's a pipeline question. How do we, there's something that I've heard people say, which is finance is like water. It follows the path of least resistance. So how can we think about reducing the resistance towards these bioeconomy enterprises, basically?
Yeah.
And
build channels towards these different enterprises.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, money is a huge enabler of these things, and if they don't go to the right projects, then it just won't happen.
Yeah, exactly.
No, and that's is part of your work, trying to connect the dots between where the traditional money is, to these new opportunities that's springing up.
Exactly. So the hub, one thing I didn't mention is that we heard from Dr. Peter Menang from C4ICRAF in the G20 last year that Africa derives less than 10% of the value of its biomass currently, which means we're largely an exporter of raw materials, and particularly of our biological materials. And we could be deriving much higher value add. That's often what we see in the bioeconomy. How do we valorize these resources, whether it's through better agro-processing or biotechnology, ideas and applications, or healthcare applications. So the hub, the Africa Bioeconomy Finance Hub's ambition is to move from less than 10% to 50%. And that's a big ambition, but part of the way we're thinking about approaching that is to think about industries that have a lot of potential in specific regions of the continent. And for example, one of the things that came out of our work last year is a SADC bioeconomy mapping. So really looking across the SADC region, which is the Southern African Development Community. It has 16 member countries. Looking at that region and saying, okay, I've given you loads of examples, but what are the areas that really have high potential for job creation, for high value add and economic growth? So we've looked across the blue bioeconomy, which can include seaweed and kelp, really interesting applications there in agriculture and healthcare and cosmetics. We've looked at industries that need to transition, like sugar, I gave that example. And then there is, the yellow, they call it the yellow bioeconomy, which is the mycoprotein, looking at all these insect applications, like are there things we could do there? So the hub will have a number of areas, case studies that have high potential, and then we'll do some of this matchmaking, but we'll work within these 4 pillars that I mentioned. So the policy enablement, the capacity building, data metrics, and investment catalyzation, and crowd in the various stakeholders. And there's a lot of, and I've mentioned them, there's a lot of great initiatives already on the continent and institutions and entities doing this work. So it's really about catalyzing the existing ecosystem to scale and drive the growth of the bioeconomy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an encompassing, all of these entities needs to pull together. And I love the 4 pillars. I've written them down so that I remember. So then, beyond the Finance Hub, or maybe complementing the Finance Hub, is there sort of one particular thing or more than one that NatureFinance or yourself would like to see to push this along?
Yes.
If you had a magic wand, go ding.
So I think for me the biggest thing would be, especially for African financial institutions and financial institutions in the global south, really seeing this as the amazing leapfrogging and market shaping opportunity that it is. Like, nature-rich countries could really be shaping a new economic model, a new way that we develop and coexist with nature. And when I speak to these financial institutions, whether they're private or development, I try and impart that with them. Like, if we can think about the renewable energy transition, developing countries could have had a much stronger market shaping role, but it does require early bets. It requires you to take some risks and redirect subsidies, or think about investments that may not make money for many, many years, which is the case for a lot of these industries. I mean, I don't know if you met Gus from Zimbabwe, who started BioInnovate Zimbabwe. He has a fantastic example about the baobab industry, and how long it took to open up markets in Europe for baobab products from Zimbabwe, but from the region as well. And how now it's a 50 billion industry.
Really?
But yes, which is like so much, right? It's unbelievable. But the fact that it took so many years to just open that up, and that's a big bet. That was a big investment from all of the actors involved, but Gus's hard work, time and money. So that would be the big thing, like particularly for players from the global south to really see the value of this. And we are seeing it in some countries, particularly like South Korea and China, really seeing this as an issue of national security, seeing this as something that every sector should take on and be responsible for. So there are countries that see this not just as a sort of side project, but as something that is like inherent to how the country develops, how it grows, how it thinks about its long-term sovereignty and resilience and survival. And for me, that is critical. But I would be remiss not to talk about the COP30 Bioeconomy Challenge, which we are also the secretariat of. It shares it also has 4 working groups.
This was COP30 in Brazil, right?
Yes.
Brazil being a big advocate for bioeconomy.
Yes, so it's really fantastic because I'm talking about leadership, but I should commend both South Africa and Brazil for its ongoing leadership in this space, particularly in a difficult multilateral setting over the last few years. And it became clear at some point last year that the US would not take this work forward in its G20 presidency. But in response to that, we've seen these really practical initiatives emerge. And one of them is the Bioeconomy Challenge launched at COP at the end of last year. And it also has 4 very similar working groups: finance mechanisms, market development and trade, which I think we've spoken a lot about, metrics and indicators, and the socio-bioeconomy and community benefits, kind of similar to what I was talking about with Indigenous knowledge earlier. And the Bioeconomy Challenge has a 3-year-long commitment. At the end of those 3 years, each of these 4 working groups will have a roadmap and hopefully a couple of pilots to really demonstrate how we implement and scale the bioeconomy at a global level. So the working groups have many stakeholders from across the world. You can still get involved. We're in the really early stages still. And I encourage everybody to have a look at that as a way to think about, how do we do it? I mean, back to your question about if there was one thing I could do, I think often the question of the bioeconomy, as I said, kind of at the beginning, sits in, an agricultural ministry or a science and technology ministry or even an environment ministry. But really, the way that we've been speaking about it, you can see that this is a development question. It's something that should feature in your development plans. It should feature in your industrial policy. It should feature in your trade policy. And NatureFinance has really tried to make the case for this. And you could use traditional industrial and development policy to grow the bioeconomy. One thing I think could be really fantastic is applying the SEZ model, so Special Economic Zones model, to the bioeconomy. We spoke a bit about this in Nairobi. So not everybody is going to have the same biological resources, capacities, even infrastructure and networks to the sort of things that you want to do. So if you take a corridors and clusters approach, which an SEZ could easily accommodate, and say, okay, for SADC or East Africa, or even one country, one region in a country, like if we had to take the rooibos example, can we think about how we use what we have, concentrate many kinds of things in one place, like an SEZ does, create incentives to grow businesses in that space, give resources for financial literacy, access to markets and market actors, and access to trade. Can we use a traditional concept like that, an SEZ, to grow the bioeconomy? You could, as a country or a region, think about the parts of the bioeconomy that have a lot of potential for you, and do that experiment. and connect it to a global market.
Yeah. That's amazing. It's I remember us talking about this corridors and clusters idea, and it just makes sense in the global South context, in the African context, to build what you can and encourage that, which with spillover effects, right, to affect the rest of the economy. So talking about bioeconomy as a really interesting solution going forward, are there any potential limitations to this solution? I mean, many examples are fascinating, as you've mentioned, but is it a silver bullet?
No, I don't think silver bullets exist, right? So at the end of the Brazilian G20 presidency, they released 10 high-level principles. And a lot of these principles look at how do we ensure that the bioeconomy is sustainable, that it accounts for local conditions and needs, that it takes a view of international commitments. Because the bioeconomy is not inherently sustainable. So, for example, there's been a lot of debate around biofuels, and if you are applying large land use change in a monoculture fashion without any regenerative agricultural practices, and that is being used to create biofuels, then that's actually not sustainable. That's actually that's not really transitioning us to a more sustainable and circular approach. So a lot of this is context specific, and for industries, for example, for maritime and aviation fuel, where there really aren't many alternatives, biofuels may be the best option right now. But I think this question of circularity and sustainability is an important one, especially for new industries, where we have to keep testing that. What really is sustainable and what is the most sustainable way we can do something in a specific context. And often this is a question of scale, because you often do need scale for something to become more sustainable or to become more resource efficient. So for example, the agricultural waste examples, it needs to really be waste, right? We shouldn't be growing things just to have them be waste. But that, again, requires scale. So it requires those agricultural outputs already having a clear use and trying to think about how that's regenerative. But the high-level principles are really quite clear on this, and they're really good guidance. So it was a very strong outcome from the Brazilian presidency. But for many new industries, this is something that needs to be interrogated as you move and progress. And I think it's really helpful to have a circular and sustainable principle moving into how we develop these industries. Because, we can't assume that they will necessarily be sustainable just because they are bio-based. But, South Africa has a pretty good blueprint in this sense, because we have really strong regulations around bioprospecting, harvesting of indigenous plants and flora and fauna, and clear regulation on beneficiation, which is also kind of speaks to one of the high-level principles, which is that, it's trying to avoid both biopiracy, but also overcultivation to the point where it becomes destructive. So in South Africa, I do think we have a good regulatory and policy interface between the Environment Ministry and the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. But again, it's going to be context specific, it's going to be industry specific. And with new industry development, that's something that you have to lead with principles and be mindful as things progress.
Yeah, so the principles gives an overall guideline, but each project is very context specific. So you have to look at the whole picture of how that project impacts, everything.
Exactly.
It's so uplifting when I talk to you about bioeconomy, and I'm so glad we managed to do this, because it's such a, as you say, it's just such a cross-cutting idea that touches so many aspects of our economy, people, our history and future. So it's, yeah, I really hope that, you know, your work at NatureFinance continues to grow, and this entire concept of bioeconomy, nature risk, you know, putting nature into our balance sheets and into decision making just continues to grow and grow and grow.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today,
Thank you.
Monique. This was a great chat, and I'm sure we will speak again very soon. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.